This course is your first step into the world of digital forensics. Welcome. Since the first personal computer was released in 1971, the increasing use of digital tools in the workplace and the home have increased to the point where their use is ubiquitous and basically second nature. The penetration of the Internet of Things into everyday items has also led to the rise of the digital environment. Very few devices now are electronically clean, so to speak, and while they provide convenience for the user, they also leave a breadcrumb trail of evidence for a well-trained forensics expert to follow. And the reality of it is, this is exactly what digital evidence is: a breadcrumb trail that can be consumed, moved, and altered far too easily. The sheer volatility of electronic evidence requires a greater degree of care and scientific rigor to achieve consistent and reliable results. In that vein, the term forensic soundness is unique to this emerging field, not found in any other. Unlike other forensic science, the act of gathering the evidence is not the only point at which the evidence, as a body, can change, but also just be reviewing the data as part of the analyst stage. Hence, when approaching electronic forensics, we need to expect a greater rigor from our experts and investigators. The electronic forensics expert needs to be able to deliver results that come from a reliable, credible, auditable, and repeatable process that can be relied on by the courts. At the end of this lesson, you will have learnt the definition of forensic science, the definition of digital forensics, uses for digital forensics, the application of Locard's exchange principle. What is the scientific method in digital forensics? And finally, the role of the forensic expert in the judicial system. The lesson will be completed with a summary of what has been learnt. Your computer will betray you. This is a lesson that many CEOs, criminals, politicians, and ordinary citizens have learned the hard way. You are leaving a trail, albeit a digital one. It's a trail, nonetheless. Like a coating of fresh snow, these ones and zeros capture our footprints as we go about our daily life. Cell phone records, ATM transactions, web searches, emails, and text messages are a few of the footprints we leave. As a society, our heavy use of technology means that we are literally drowning in electronically stored information. The impact of our growing digital dependence is being felt in many domains, not the least of which is the legal system. Every day, digital evidence is finding its way into the world's courts. Gone are the days when records were strictly paper. This new form of evidence presents some very significant challenges to our legal system. Digital evidence is considerably different from paper documents and can't be handled in the same way. Change, therefore, is inevitable. But the legal system doesn't turn on a dime. In fact, it's about as nimble as the Titanic. It's struggling now to catch up with the blinding speed of technology. Criminal, civil, and administrative proceedings often focus on digital evidence, which is foreign to many of the key players, including attorneys and judges. We all know people who don't check their own email or even know how to surf the internet. Some lawyers, judges, business professionals, and police fit into that category as well. Unfortunately for those people, this blissful ignorance is no longer an option. Where law-abiding society goes, the criminals will be slightly ahead. They have joined us on our laptops, cell phones, iPads, and the internet. Criminals will always follow the money and leverage any tools, including technology, that can aid in the commission of their crimes. Although forensic science has been around for years, digital forensics is still in its infancy. It's still finding its place among the other more established forensic disciplines, such as DNA and toxicology. As a discipline, it is where DNA was many years ago. Standards and best practices are still being developed. Digital forensics starts with the ones and zeros. This binary language underpins not only the function of the computer, but how it stores data as well. We need to understand how these ones and zeros are converted into the text, images, and videos we routinely consume and produce on our computers. The definition of forensic science is the application of scientific knowledge, process and methodology to legal proceedings and criminal investigations. Saferstein, 2018. Increasingly, society has become dependent on the rules of law to regulate itself. Forensic science applies knowledge and technology to the development and enforcement of these laws. Whilst the focus of this course is on computers and digital media, digital forensics is only one of many forensic disciplines that do not exist in isolation. When attending an incident scene, the digital forensic investigator must be mindful of the other forensic disciplines that may also have a role to play in the investigation and analysis of that incident scene. Whilst a digital forensic investigator may initially be the only forensic specialist requested, it is incumbent upon them to recognize other potential forensic evidence at an incident scene and to advise the task leader of the need not only for additional services, but also the types of service required. The digital forensic investigator should also be aware of how to preserve other evidence until the arrival of the appropriate forensic expert. Electronic forensics, or as it is more commonly known, digital forensics, is the use of scientifically derived and proven methods towards the preservation, collection, validation, identification, analysis, interpretation, and presentation of electronic evidence derived from electronic sources for the purpose of facilitating or furthering the reconstruction of events found to be criminal, or helping to anticipate the unauthorized actions shown to be disruptive to planned operations. One important element of electronic forensics is the credibility of the electronic evidence. Electronic evidence includes computer evidence, electronic audio, electronic video, cell phones, electronic fax machines, etc. The legal settings desire evidence to have integrity, authenticity, reproductively, non-interference, and minimization. Palmer, 2001. Breaking down this definition, we see that the key element of electronic forensics is that it is a scientific process that is credible. This credibility is the key to successfully providing electronic evidence that is of use to the law enforcement community, as well as the intelligence and military communities. Legal arguments are won on the strength of the credibility of the evidence, and in this, electronic forensics is no different to any other evidence. Also, electronic devices comprise not just computers, tablets, and laptops. Nearly every device running using electricity now has some form of microprocessor and data storage. From cars to fridges to pacemakers, there are a multitude of devices that can come into the sphere of electronic forensics. This Internet of Things not only opens avenues of attack for hackers, but also for forensics experts. In the end, the securing and exploitation of electronic forensics is a scientific process, and as such must be viewed as something that is repeatable and auditable. Digital forensics can be used in a variety of settings, including criminal investigations, civil litigation, intelligence, administrative, and for intelligence matters. Criminal investigations. When you mention digital forensics in the context of a criminal investigation, people tend to think first in terms of child pornography and identity theft. Although those investigations certainly focus on digital evidence, they are by no means the only two. In today's digital world, electronic evidence can be found in almost any criminal investigation conducted. Homicide, sexual assault, robbery, and burglary are just a few of the many examples of analog crimes that can leave digital evidence. One of the major struggles in law enforcement is to change the paradigm of the police and get them to think of and seek out digital evidence. Everyday digital devices such as cell phones and gaming consoles can hold a treasure trove of evidence. Unfortunately, none of that evidence will ever see a courtroom if it's not first recognized and collected. As time moves on and our law enforcement agencies are replenished with younger blood, this will become less and less of a problem. Bind, torture, kill. The case of Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK killer, is a great example of the critical role digital forensics can play in a criminal investigation. This case had national attention and, thanks to digital forensics, was solved 30 years later. To all that knew him before his arrest, Dennis Rader was a family man, church member, and dedicated public servant. What they didn't know was that he was also an accomplished serial killer. Dennis Rader, known as Bind, Torture, Kill, BTK, murdered 10 people in Kansas from 1974 to 1991. Rader managed to avoid capture for over 30 years until technology betrayed him. After years of silence, Rader sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper declaring that he was responsible for the 1986 killing of a young mother. The letter was received by the Eagle on March 19, 2004. After conferring with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the police decided to attempt to communicate with BTK through the media. In January 2005, Rader left a note for police stating he would use a floppy disk to communicate. On February 16, a manila envelope arrived at KSAS, the Fox affiliate in Wichita. Inside was a purple floppy disk from BTK. The disk contained a file named Test A, RTF. The RTF extension stands for Rich Text File. A forensic exam of the file struck gold. The file's metadata, the data about the data, gave investigators the leads they had been waiting over 30 years for. Aside from the date created and the date modified, were the title Christ Lutheran Church and Last Saved By. Armed with this information, investigators quickly logged onto the Christ Lutheran Church website. There they found that Dennis Rader was the president of the church's congregation council. The noose was tightening, but it wasn't tight enough. Investigators turned to DNA to make the case airtight. Detectives went on to obtain a DNA sample from Rader's daughter and compared it to DNA from BTK. The results proved that BTK was her father. On February 25, 3 days after the DNA sample arrived at the lab, Rader was arrested, sealing the fate of BTK. He is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences. Civil litigation. The use of digital forensics in civil cases is big business. In 2011, the estimated total worth of the electronic discovery market is somewhere north of $780 million, Global EDD Group. As part of a process known as electronic discovery, e-discovery, digital forensics has become a major component of much high-dollar litigation. E-discovery refers to any process in which electronic data is sought, located, secured, and searched with the intent of using it as evidence in a civil or criminal legal case. In a civil case, both parties are generally entitled to examine the evidence that will be used against them prior to trial. This legal process is known as discovery. Previously, discovery was largely a paper-based exercise, with each party exchanging reports, letters, and memos. However, the introduction of digital forensics and e-discovery has greatly changed this practice. The proliferation of the computer has rendered that practice nearly extinct. Today, parties no longer talk about filing cabinets, ledgers, and memos, they talk about hard drives, spreadsheets, and file types. Some paper-based materials may come into play, but it's more the exception than the rule. Seeing the evidentiary landscape rapidly changing, the courts have begun to modify the rules of evidence. Digital evidence can quickly become the focal point of a case, no matter what kind of legal proceeding it's used in. The legal system and all its players are struggling to deal with this new reality. Intelligence. Terrorists and foreign governments, the purview of our intelligence agencies, have also joined the digital age. Terrorists have been using information technology to communicate, recruit, and plan attacks. In Iraq and Afghanistan, our armed forces are exploiting intelligence collected from digital devices brought straight from the battlefield. This process is known as DOMEX, document and media exploitation. DOMEX is paying large dividends, providing actionable intelligence to support the soldiers on the ground. Locard's exchange principle. Whenever two objects come into contact with one another, there is exchange of materials between them. Edmund Locard postulated that when a person comes into contact with an object or another person, materials were exchanged, Locard's exchange principle. Locard postulated that a criminal could be connected to a crime by material from that crime scene. This became known as trace evidence and is often transferred by heat or friction. Such analysis is of great use in forensic engineering. The same holds true in digital forensics. Registry keys and log files can serve as the digital equivalent to hair and fiber. Like DNA, our ability to detect and analyze these artifacts relies heavily on the technology available at the time. Look at the numerous cold cases that are being solved as a result of the significant advances in DNA science. Viewing a device or incident through the lens of Locard's principle can be very helpful in locating and interpreting not only physical, but digital evidence as well. The digital forensics investigator may elect to apply the scientific method to digital forensics, which is explained as: forensic analysis of digital evidence depends on the case context and largely relies on the knowledge, experience, expertise, thoroughness, and in some cases the curiosity of the practitioner performing the work. Although every forensic analysis will have differing aspects based on the dataset, objectives, resources, and other factors, the underlying process remains fundamentally the same. Casey, 2010. Gather information and make observations. This phase is sometimes referred to as forensic examination. The objective of this phase is to review and ensure the integrity of the evidence, performing a survey of all evidence to determine how to proceed most effectively, and doing some pre-processing to find deleted data, filter out irrelevant data, handle special files, and extract embedded metadata. This phase may include keyword searching and a preliminary review of system configuration. This phase need not be limited to digital evidence and can be augmented by interviews, witness statements, and other materials or intelligence. Form a hypothesis to explain observations. While digital forensic investigators are gathering information about the crime under investigation, we develop possible explanations for what we are seeing in the digital evidence. Although such conjecture is often influenced by the knowledge and experience of a forensic practitioner, we must guard against preconceived notions that are based on personal prejudice rather than facts. Evaluate the hypothesis. Various predictions will flow naturally from any hypothesis. If the hypothesis is true, then we would expect to find X in the evidence. And it is our job, as digital forensic investigator, to determine whether such expectations are borne out by the evidence. The success of a forensic analysis hinges on how thoroughly an initial hypothesis is attacked. Accordingly, considering other plausible explanations and tests to disprove a hypothesis are crucial. If the hypothesis is false, then we would expect to find Y. If experiments and observations do not support the initial hypothesis, we revise our hypothesis and perform further tests. Draw conclusions and communicate findings. Once a hypothesis has been established as more than likely, the digital forensic investigator must convey their work to decision makers. Observe that the scientific method is cyclic, potentially requiring forensic analysts to repeat these steps until a conclusion can be made. If experiments disprove the initial hypothesis, a new one must be formed and evaluated. Even when some experiments support the hypothesis, new information often emerges that must be considered and tested to determine whether the hypothesis still holds. Casey, 2010. The digital forensics investigator most often plays the role of an expert witness. So, what makes them different than non-expert witnesses? Other witnesses can only testify to what they did or saw. They are generally limited to those areas and not permitted to render an opinion. Experts, by contrast, can and often do give their opinion. What makes someone an expert? In the legal sense, it's someone who can assist the judge or jury to understand and interpret evidence they may be unfamiliar with. To be considered an expert in a court of law, one doesn't have to possess an advanced academic degree. An expert simply must know more about a particular subject than the average lay person. Under the legal definition, a doctor, scientist, baker, or garbage collector could be qualified as an expert witness in a court of law. Individuals are qualified as experts by the court based on their training, experience, education, and so on. What separates a qualified expert from a truly effective one? It is their ability to communicate with the judge and jury. They must be effective teachers. The vast majority of society lacks technical understanding to fully grasp this kind of testimony without at least some explanation. Digital forensic investigators must carry out their duties without bias. Lastly, a digital forensics examiner must go where the evidence takes them without any preconceived notions. The challenge of the CSI effect. It seems that everyone either does or has watched one or more versions of the popular TV series CSI. These shows and others like it tend to convince jurors that some form of forensic science can solve any case. In other words, they now expect it. These unreasonable expectations can lead to incorrect verdicts. The jury could acquit a guilty defendant simply because no scientific evidence was presented, the presumption being that if the defendant was guilty, there would be some kind of scientific evidence to prove it. This is a major challenge for investigators, and something to be borne in mind.
In summary, in this lesson we covered what forensic science, particularly digital forensics, is and its uses. We learned that forensic sciences aren't the fast-paced crime-solving dramas that we watch on television, but a scientific method of collection, investigation and analysis used to solve some kind of legal problem. We learned that digital forensics isn't limited to computers. It encompasses any kind of electronic device that can store data. These devices include cell phones, tablets, and GPS units, just to name a few. We learned that digital forensics is applicable well beyond criminal investigations. It's used routinely in civil litigation, national and military intelligence matters, as well as the private sector. Finally, we learned that as an investigator, communication skills are extremely important. You will spend a significant amount of time explaining your findings to police officers, attorneys, and clients. Most important, you must be able to explain these things to judges and juries.